Hello and welcome. You are listening to The Voice of Reason. Thank you for joining me today for this episode. And before we jump in, I'd like to remind you all to like, share, and subscribe. And I'd like to just give everyone a huge thank you for all of the support that you've been giving me all over social media. So thanks again, like, share, and subscribe, and let's get these videos out to the whole world. In a previous episode, we discussed the schism that occurred in the year 431, which resulted in the Assyrian Church of the East breaking communion with the rest of Christendom. In this video, we're going to get into the next major schism that occurred only 20 years later in the year 451 at the Ecumenical Council of Chalcedon. The Ecumenical Council of Chalcedon in 451 resulted, unfortunately, in the apostolic churches of the Middle East breaking communion with the rest of Christendom. So what is the reason for this unfortunate schism? When you look into history, you'll see that the schism could have been avoided and it should have been avoided. It was very unfortunate the way that it occurred, and most of it was really due to the language barriers between the people that were involved. So, before we can get into the Council of Chalcedon in 451, we have to remember that the church was just coming off of the Ecumenical Council at Ephesus 20 years prior, the council that resulted in the schism of the Church of the East. And unfortunately, the church was still dealing with the shockwaves of the Nestorian heresy. It was after the Council of Ephesus that the Bishop of Rome, Pope Leo I, wrote what is now known as Leo's Tome. In his tome, Pope Leo wrote about how Jesus is the second person of the Holy Trinity, how he is God, he is a divine person with a divine nature, and that this divine person with his divine nature took on human flesh and became man and assumed a human nature, and that these two natures were distinct but not separate, that they were in perfect harmony with each other without confusion, without commingling, and that these two natures also had corresponding wills. So Jesus is God. He is a divine person with a divine nature and the divine will, who assumed a human nature with a corresponding human will without sacrificing any of his divinity. So he was truly God and truly man at the same time, always and forever from the moment of the incarnation. And this is everything that Pope Leo spelled out in his tome. And he did this because he was very concerned about the unfortunate schism that happened in 431, that he didn't want there to be any more confusion whatsoever about Christology. So he lined it all out together in one tome, and that tome was sent out to all of the other apostolic churches so that they could all sign off on it, so that everyone would be on the same page, so all the bishops would be in agreement with true Christology. This is, however, where the situation starts getting a little bit complicated. You see, this is in the early 5th century. At this time, the Church of the West, that is the western part of the Roman Empire or Western Europe, they had adopted Latin as their official language. So all of the bishops of Rome, all of the popes, they wrote their papal documents in Latin, meaning that these documents had to be translated into the Greek for the Church of the Eastern Europe, of Eastern Roman Empire, but then the document would have to be further translated because other apostolic churches had began using the vernacular languages of their regions as well. So all of the churches in the Middle East started using their own languages as well liturgically. You had Syriac used as a language in West Syria, you had Coptic being used in Egypt, Armenian being used in Armenia, and all of the other local languages such as Arabic in the languages in the Middle East. So Leo's tome had to be translated from the Latin into the Greek, and then it was translated from the Greek into all of these other vernacular languages. So all of the churches in the eastern part of the empire, what is now known as the Eastern Orthodox churches, all of these churches actually agreed and signed off on Leo's tome. They accepted it as being Christologically orthodox. But when the tome got to all of these churches in the Middle East, because of the language barrier, it was translated into all of the different local languages. Some of the ideas that Pope Leo had espoused in the document had been lost in translation, and it appears that some of these apostolic churches in the Middle East were not sure about the orthodoxy of the tome, and they suspected that it might be Nestorian. Even though it wasn't Nestorian, there was a suspicion by these apostolic churches that it was Nestorian, which was due to, again, the language barrier, because it's kind of difficult to translate something from Latin into Greek, into Syriac, Coptic, Armenian, Arabic. It's difficult. So some of these apostolic Christians suspected that the document might have been Nestorian, which everybody in the church was weary of because the Nestorian heresy had popped up just 20 years earlier. So because even the Patriarch of Alexandria himself had reservations about signing off on the Tome of Leo, the Universal Church thought that it would be appropriate to hold another ecumenical council. Now, it's important to understand that this ecumenical council took place in the year 451, just 20 years after the previous ecumenical council. This is a very, very, very short turnaround, as usually ecumenical councils are about 70, 75, or over 100 years in between. So the fact that these two councils happened so close to each other just shows that there was a lot of turmoil in the church going on at this time over rampant heresy. So the ecumenical council was convened by the Roman emperor, and it took place at Chalcedon in the year 451. And this is where it gets really interesting and really unfortunate. You see, back in those days, it wasn't easy to travel to a place from another region of the world for an ecumenical council. Not all bishops were able to make it. Certain bishops that aren't able to make it to ecumenical councils, what they would do is that they would actually write letters to the councils, send representatives to the councils, because they wouldn't be able to leave their diocese or their eparchy because they had to stay there to run the church. So they would write these letters and they would send representatives to the council, and these letters would be read aloud for the rest of the bishops in attendance at the council to hear. So when the council happened, all of the bishops gathered, and the bishops who weren't in attendance had their letters read out loud. And in these letters written by the bishops who were not present, they all affirmed and agreed with the tome of Pope Leo. They agreed with all of the Christology there. But here is where it gets really messy. So there were 3 letters that were read out loud by 3 different ecclesial men. These 3 men were Theodore of Mopsuestia, Theodoret of Cyrus, and Ebas of Edessa. These 3 churchmen had their writings read out loud at the council, and in their writings they affirmed the theology of Pope Leo's tome. But then when they themselves, in their own words, started explaining their understanding of Christology, all 3 of these guys were clearly Nestorians themselves. So they wrote letters agreeing with the Pope of Rome, Pope Leo, and agreeing with the true Orthodox Christology, but then in their own explanation of that Christology in their letters, it was heretical. It was Nestorian. So these 3 letters were read out loud at the council, and as they were being read, it was very awkward that they were reading out letters from these men who affirmed Pope Leo, but then gave the heterodox Christology. So these letters were read out loud, and then they were just ignored. The church didn't say anything about them. They just read them, moved on to other letters from other bishops, and then just kept going. But when these 3 letters from these 3 different guys were read out loud, it further scandalized the bishops of the Middle East. They were falsely affirmed in their suspicion that maybe Leo's tome was Nestorius. Leo's tome wasn't Nestorius. These 3 writers, Theodore, Theodoret, and Ebas, affirmed Pope Leo's true understanding, but then gave the false understanding. So it further confused the bishops of the Middle East, including the Patriarch of Alexandria. And because the council didn't say anything at the time, they just moved on and kept reading, it scandalized these bishops. And unfortunately, they decided that they had to break communion with the rest of Christendom, because they had mistakenly believed that, like they mistakenly believed with the Church of the East, that the Church of Rome, the Church of Constantinople, also fell into the heresy of Nestorianism. So again, it was a huge misunderstanding. Just like the schism from 20 years earlier was based off of a misunderstanding of Nestorius, the schism 20 years later in 451 was also based off of a huge misunderstanding, once again going back to Nestorius. The Church of Rome, the Church of Constantinople, and all of the churches in communion with these 2 patriarchs had the true, correct Orthodox Christology. The same Christology that matches the Christology of the Oriental Orthodox Church today. But because the Oriental Orthodox Church, because of language issues and language barriers, they were unable to understand the orthodoxy of Leo's tome. And because of the mistake of reading aloud these three letters that were in conflict with Leo's tome, that was enough to cause the churches of the Middle East to break communion with the rest of Christendom. So the Oriental Orthodox Communion broke away in the year 451, and it consists of the churches of West Syria, of Egypt, Armenia, Eritrea, Ethiopia, and there was also churches in India that left communion as well and came into communion with the Oriental Orthodox Church. So it's important to understand that the Council of Chalcedon, the whole purpose of it was to clarify Christology, to once again condemn the Nestorian heresy, but it resulted in another schism over a misunderstanding. The Council of Chalcedon rejected the Monophysite heresy, and the Oriental Orthodox Church broke away from the Chalcedonian Christians, but the Oriental Orthodox Church also rejects Monophysitism. The Oriental Orthodox Church holds to what's called Miaphysite Christology, which is actually the same Christology as Chalcedonian Christology. So again, there is no difference in the Christologies. The schism was over the unfortunate language barrier, which resulted in a huge misunderstanding. But the Oriental Orthodox Church, as well as Chalcedonian Christianity, as well as the Assyrian Church of the East, all have the same Christology. So both of these schisms should not have happened. It was very unfortunate, and we have to pray for a full reunion between the Oriental Orthodox Church and the Chalcedonian Christians. And reunion actually has happened partially because of those 6 churches that I mentioned: the Syriac Church, the Coptic Church, the Armenian Church, the Ethiopian Church, the Eritrean Church, the Malankara Church. Every single one of these churches has partially come back into communion with Rome. So reunion is possible, and we have to pray that reunion happens between all 4 apostolic communions. So thank you all once again for joining me for today's episode. Please leave your comments down below. What do you think about these unfortunate schisms? How do you think that the church will proceed moving forward? How do we bring all of these apostolic churches together? Leave your comments down below. Leave any questions that you have down below, and I'll see you in the next video. And remember to like, share, and subscribe. See you soon.